The projected aging of the U.S. population will impact the workplace and all aspects of our society over the coming decades. Hi, I'm Will Pettigo, producer of the latest installment in NPT's Aging Matters series, Aging and the Workplace. We're going to continue the conversation in 3 directions over the next 30 minutes. First, we'll look at one result of Americans working longer, a multi-generational workforce. What does it mean if you have employees spanning 60 years all together at once? Here to offer their perspective on that topic are Eddie Lunn, CEO of Boiler Supply, and Meredith Jones, Managing Partner at Sera Business Advisors. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Meredith, let's start with you. Is this multi-generational workforce a new thing?
Actually, within the HR community, it's been an emerging trend that's been talked about for the past 5 or so years. But recently, the emphasis on generational differences has really been on the forefront, and it's definitely a topic of discussion within the HR community.
And Eddie, in the documentary, we hear about your business and really struggling to have both recruitment and the retention of your workers. So how does that multi-generational workforce work for you all?
Well, we have been just trying to bridge the gap between our more seasoned boiler technicians and boiler makers, and then the new generation coming in and becoming that same seasoned group, and trying to blend the personalities and blend the differences, and just getting them to work together and share their common knowledge and respect each other has been something that we've been really trying to work and develop and make it part of our culture.
So I guess, is it generational differences? Is that what this is about?
I think we do have generational differences. There is a different approach to work. I think a lot of times you hear a work ethic out of one and not out of another. I think they both have a work ethic. It's just different, and having to and getting the two to blend together, the two groups to respect the other person's approach, their style, and to embrace kind of the differences and learn from each other and work well together.
So, what kind of generations are you talking about? Describe the generations that you have working at Boiler Supply.
So we have an entire generation that grew up learning boilers in large part through the Navy, working through naval ships that were steam powered. The Navy has shifted from boilers and steam powered in most of their ships over to nuclear, and so we are having another generation that is not trained in that same way. And so they're coming up, and they're choosing to work with their hands, and they're choosing to be a part of this industry, and we're having to train them, and they're having to learn and grow from the older generation. I guess that would be the boomers and before generation, and then the millennials and the generation that's coming up now.
And Meredith, what kinds of issues do you see in the businesses you work with?
I think the biggest issue is perspective and assumptions.
Right.
I think our older workers have assumptions around the younger generations. They don't want to work. They don't have to earn their own way. That's the way we did it when we came up through the ranks. In comparison with the millennials, who don't tell me what to do or how to do it, just let me do what I want to do the way I want to do it.
Yeah, so are those assumptions accurate? I think one of the issues that we see with you are trying to define people by generations, right? Multi-generational workforce, but really a company is built around individuals, right? Is it even accurate to make these big generational assumptions?
No, I don't think it's accurate to do that. Does it happen? Yes. Is it one of the issues that employers try to hedge? Yes. Are they successful at doing it? Sometimes. It really depends on the individuals that are involved within the company and how much they allow themselves to get outside their own comfort zone and look at issues or topics from another person's perspective.
All right, so let's maybe thinking a little differently about generationalism, perhaps. Let's say you have seasoned employees, and then you have kind of new recruits. But I imagine also the boiler technology is changing, right? So no one is going to be able to avoid learning new skills, right? Like one of the assumptions that maybe people don't approach learning the same way. How do you try to bridge those different facts to have a skilled workforce overall?
Well, that definitely has been, a challenge in the technology and changing in the boilers. In the past, it took a wrench and a screwdriver to set combustion on a boiler. Now, on a lot of them, it takes a laptop. And one of our challenges has been, some of our guys do not want to learn how to use a laptop, and we understand that, and we can work with that. But then at the same time, if a boiler goes down in the middle of the night and it's got a control system on it that is a more complex system, it's going to take a laptop to go and do some of those things. So
you need a staff that's really prepared to deal with both those, or are you looking towards that computer savvy to call them and wake them up in the middle of the night or your veteran guy came out of the Navy who really knows how to make that older machine work, right?
Right. And so we just know that, when certain guys are on to call, they have the older generation they can call on and to say, hey, this is an older unit, I haven't seen this before, what can I do? And then when the older or the more seasoned tech is on call and he gets into a control system problem, we have the younger guys that they can call, and so it really builds and develops that respect and that mutual respect between the two to grow and develop them.
And I guess, you're really talking about needing to make these generations, this all work together, because you need to keep those skills that have developed over the decades. You need to pass that on. That's part of having that workforce that can work together, right?
Exactly. You've got to have both. We've got to leverage the past, because it's going to be around. I like to say, until water boils at a different temperature than 212, it's still going to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. So you've got to have that history, but then you've got to, with the efficiency demands and the emission controls that are out there, and we've got to have the new side. So it's a blend of the two, and getting them to work and share their knowledge between the two is.
Yeah. And Meredith, is boiler supply, kind of ahead of the curve in thinking about these issues, or are a lot of businesses now having to think about, how they're going to grow their workforce as the U.S. population continues to age over the coming decades?
I do agree that boiler supply is ahead of the curve, and smart companies are thinking about how to blend these different perspectives and skill sets. They're providing opportunities with training, with just work groups, et cetera, as far as bringing the opposite ends of the spectrum together to knowledge share, to cross-pollinate. And companies that are proactively doing that are finding themselves in a much better, more successful position for the future as far as the handoff and succession planning when our older workers decide for their next chapter in their life as compared to the up-and-comers.
If you had any sort of last bits of advice to businesses that are going to be tackling this issue, what would you recommend for them?
Flexibility, I think, is one of the key words that's needed in today's work environment, particularly as it relates to learning a different perspective and seeing new and different things, as well as being open to the way it was done back in the good old days.
Mm-hmm. And does that ring true for you as well?
Very much so. It very much is exactly the way it is. You've got to blend. You've got to be flexible. You got to admire and respect the best in both and blend that.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us in this section. We're about to move on to the second part of our discussion and introduce another guest. Coming up next, in the United States, the 1967 Age Discrimination Employment Act started protecting workers over the age of 40 from unfair treatment based on age. So how far have we come in creating a work environment where employees are treated equally regardless of age? We'll talk about age discrimination after this introduction to ageism in the workplace.
My practice involves advising employers on a daily basis about all aspects of discrimination, including age. And that's the legal part of it. The legal definition of ageism in the employment context is discrimination based on age against an employee or an applicant who's over the age of 40. And that has many forms. Disparate treatment, which is an adverse action, someone being treated differently based upon their age or a stereotype, or a neutral policy or procedure that disproportionately affects people of a certain age. It's important for employers to know that something could be legal, but still be inappropriate or unacceptable in the workplace. It could be something just as simple as making jokes, or how people handle birthday parties, or being sort of inappropriate or sarcastic, things that happen all the time, but could later lead to a legal issue. What I try to advise is you have to be cognizant that everybody's different. The workplace is very diverse. No matter what the job is, have an environment that's open, where people can feel comfortable being at work and being who they are, and not feeling disrespected, whether it's age or any other reason. You want people to feel like their concerns will be addressed. And so a culture in which the leadership buys into the policies and procedures, understand those policies and procedures, and then project sort of top-down leadership, where people can look at the people that are above them in management or even at HR and feel like they take these issues seriously. I think those foster the best working environments.
All right, Meredith Jones from Sera Business Advisors, thanks for sticking with us. And joining us is Joycelyn Stevenson, shareholder from Littler, a firm specializing in employment and labor law. Thanks for joining us as well. I want to start out by talking about, okay, what kinds of cases are you seeing come up through your firm? And is ageism, is this on a rise as well as more folks deal with an increasing number of older Americans who are in the workplace?
Sure, well, I see lots of cases. With respect to this particular issue of age and ageism in the workplace, issues involving individuals who feel marginalized, who feel like they've been working for a long time, that they are not being treated the same as someone that may be younger, people who feel like there's a neutral policy but it disproportionately affects people of a certain age. I see lots of cases like that, hiring cases where people feel like the job description or even the interviewing process gave a preference for someone that might have been younger. Those are the kinds of cases that I see and sometimes advise on. On the issue about being on the rise, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission publishes each year a list of all the charges that have been filed in the past year, all the lawsuits that have been filed. And I think in the past year there are about 20,000 age-related type of charges, and that's been on the trend for the past few years. But I do see an increase in interest with agencies investigating things like mandatory retirement programs, pension programs, things involving hiring or language that are in job descriptions. Those are being highly scrutinized now.
So, we know that there's a law in place that protects folks who are 40 and older. But a lot of issues around ageism don't necessarily wind up in court. If you go further downstream, what are the issues that you're seeing maybe and trying to prevent as you all work with companies? Meredith, you want to talk a little bit about kind of the policies and procedures that you try to instill in a business to help prevent some of these issues?
Sure. I think just your normal course of business, you've got to treat everybody as individuals and respect the skills and abilities that they each offer. But as far as business practices go, let's take training, for example. You don't want to just train your new, young, fresh out of school college graduates and ignore your seasoned professionals, because that would be unfair. Our older workforce wants to continue to learn and grow, just as our new entrants want to learn and grow. So that's just an example of something a company can do to ensure that you're leveling the playing field, allowing all age groups the opportunity to continue their career.
Right.
And I think that feeds into another example of interest that I get from clients about issues like this, where there's training or something that happens and people are left out, or assumptions are made about people based upon either just thinking, well, maybe they don't want to learn this, or they won't get it.
Right.
And those little things can lead to issues later.
And you're talking about training, and that's maybe job skills or working towards promotions, those kinds of things, which again you're saying should be available to everyone.
Right.
But I know you also do some trainings with employees and employers, and my understanding is you tend to focus on the C-suite, the executives, the management style folks when you are doing training around trying to avoid cases of discrimination of all forms. Why is that?
Well, I do that because I do lots of trainings, and I love it. It's part of my practice is the litigation piece, but I like the training piece because it helps people resolve some of these issues on the front end. And so I do quite a bit of training for managers, lower level employees. But my philosophy is that if it's not top down, if the C-suite does not buy in to the policy or the practice of a company, then it doesn't matter. You know, you have to have a policy, absolutely, but everyone has to buy in. And so I see when I do trainings where it's a lower level management training, but the CEO is there, the CFO is there, someone from management from HR is there, it gives the impression that the company takes this seriously and that people feel like their concerns would be addressed.
And I think coupled with that transparency, certainly the tone is set at the top, as you mentioned, but also a company who is willing to be transparent about their approach, about their decision-making process, about their pay practices. The more transparent a company can be, the less employees get to make up their own story. And so from a culture perspective, if you have a strong leadership team that has the ability and the foresight to address some of these issues before they happen, the company's in a lot more successful position.
Right, so it's one thing maybe to have policies that are discriminatory. What about just attitudes, the more, perhaps implicit forms of discrimination, conversations, jokes, the way birthday parties are, those things that kind of maybe hurt someone's feelings and then, could potentially lead to something along down the line. What's your advice to companies about those kinds of issues?
I get that a lot too in trainings. People say we can't do anything, we can't say anything anymore. And I don't want to go that far, but I do think you have to be careful because workplaces are very diverse. People have different interests,
right.
And particularly with things like just jokes or emails or being on a listserv, those things are fine sometimes, but sometimes they can go too far, and you don't know who your audience is sometimes. And so I think for me, I always tell people to caution and be careful about what you put in the email. How would you how would you perceive this if you were that person? And just be respectful of people in the workplace, and be understanding that not everyone's going to get the same jokes or feel the same way about something. But I think, again, that's sometimes a management issue and a top-down issue as to what kind of culture you have. But I think you do want to at least have a culture that, at least at a minimum, there's a level of respect that there is a concern that's raised, that people understand it, and they can figure out how to move on from it.
And two phrases that I often use are perception is reality and when in doubt, don't.
That's good advice. Yeah, what about sort of if you're this sense of a professional presence versus maybe someone's personal beliefs and finding a way to divide that line? Is that even possible? How do you encourage that?
I think it's possible. I think we all have our own workplaces where we have fun and we go out and do things, but we also have a form of understanding that not everyone has the same beliefs politically about certain issues. And so you have to figure out a way to balance that. I always tell people that I train that when you're at home, you can do and say whatever you want to say in your own house. But in the workplace, there are at least probably 500 to 1,000 other people that are all believing different things, working in the same direction, trying to accomplish a goal. And that ultimately is the important thing in a workplace.
Yeah. So what about the idea? You've got this law in 1967 protects folks age 40 and above. But when we were talking about multi-generational workforce and this boomers versus millennials and that kind of, I guess age discrimination really can go the other way, right? How do you want people to think to sort of have an understanding where everyone is sort of treated equally and perhaps someone isn't discriminated against who's under 40?
Well, I think that goes back to the assumptions piece of it too. I think, there are people that assume things because of someone's age, and even people who might be under 40. At 25 years old, I was a caregiver and had to deal with some of the same issues as someone else who might have been older, and had to figure out how to navigate that. And not a lot of people, at that time were dealing with those issues, but some were. And so I think you have to be able to sort of see where people are, be flexible and be understanding, and figure out a way to have dialogue with all generations so that you do have an open and transparent type of business where people feel comfortable and not marginalized.
Yeah.
And even talking about issues, having book clubs that might bring an issue that normally wouldn't be discussed in the workplace into the workplace, but then setting ground rules and creating a safe environment to talk about hard issues. Recognizing that, you know, whenever we do training, we invoke the Vegas rule. What
happens in training stays in
That's right. What happens in training stays in training. But that really is impactful because it allows individuals to feel like they can speak freely and have an opinion, but it also creates the respect and the ground rules for having those conversations.
I think the training piece is really important, and I agree 100% because I do a lot of training with videos, and some of the situations and scenarios are very uncomfortable, but it allows that dialogue for people to feel safe to talk about these issues.
Because you want to make sure that these issues aren't implicit, that we are building some more awareness so that we can say like, oh man, maybe I shouldn't have said that.
Right.
That's right.
All right, well, we're ready to move on to our next conversation. You know, there are lots of folks who are taking on additional responsibilities. One of those that is a real challenge for finding a work-life balance is in the coming decades, there's going to be a lot more folks providing care for a loved one. Let's take a look at how some workplaces are beginning to respond.
You have a job and you have a family. The reality of the situation is if you are pulled in a direction that is outside of work, your focus then cannot be on work. It's a big pull for our staff whose parents are now not able to take care of themselves anymore.
What we do in nursing is take care of people, but that doesn't stop when we leave our employment. When we go home, the nurse in the family is going to be the first one that gets called when something happens to a family member.
Doing okay, Dr. Williams?
When your neighbors know you're a nurse, they do call on you. You know, they need all types of things. They need glucometers checked. Can you come and check my blood sugar? Can you take my blood pressure? Sometimes they don't need health care. They need somebody to do grocery store runs, and you just assess whatever they need, you try to supply it.
When you think about the nurse who's, you know, in that 50 to 60 age range, they may still have teenagers, early adults who are staying at home longer, and then they've got their aging parents that they're having to take care of. That's that person that is so needed in the healthcare agency because of the years of experience they have.
One of the things that we look at is how can we as a system support our staff to support their families.
Many of the HR benefit programs that you're seeing in healthcare agencies now, just like we provide daycare for children, they will provide assistance for the daycare that may be needed for an older parent. And it's to be able to retain that very experienced knowledge worker in the healthcare environment.
Joining us to talk about how caregiving impacts the workplace are Mark Singer from the Area Agency on Aging and Disability, Jennifer Abernathy, Executive Director of the Tennessee Respite Coalition, as well as Meredith Jones from Sera Business Advisors. So Mark, talk a little bit about, you have a job where you are receiving calls from the community, a lot of folks who are looking for resources. What kind of issues do you see caregivers calling you and trying to find in our community?
Well, every day we have individuals contacting us looking for some sort of help or services for their parent or their loved one or someone of their family. You know, they're in a working environment where they're working at work and their parent is at home, and they need someone to just, maybe come and talk to them. Someone to come and, mom's not safe to be at home alone for long periods of time. So they're looking for any sort of resource or avenue so that their loved one can be at home in a safe environment. So we get lots of calls of that nature, looking for any level of care or services for an individual in the home.
And are those resources available?
There are resources that are available. There are different programs that the state of Tennessee has that can provide some level of home and community-based services for individuals in the home. Each of these programs have their own, say, eligibility guidelines.
Right.
So depending on what the level of care the individual needs in the home will depend on what program the individual very well may qualify for getting some services in the home.
And Jennifer, with the Tennessee Respite Coalition, you're dealing with a lot of different caregivers. What kind of strain is that caregiving putting on your caregivers' work lives?
Oh, an enormous amount of strain. We hear a lot about caregivers being afraid to tell their employees that they're in a caregiving situation because they're afraid that they could get fired, that the employer's not going to think they can do their job anymore. And that's when people really get into trouble because they're not able to take the time to properly care for the person that they have at home. And then of course caring for themselves as a caregiver is so important too, that it's an enormous strain.
So now all of a sudden you've got someone who's caring for someone, they're not telling their boss, so maybe they're just all of a sudden showing up at 10:30 in the morning, and this starts to become an issue. Why aren't they showing up on time? So
Right.
would you advise folks to then try to at least not suffer in silence, tell your employer what's going on in your life so they can either do something about it or not?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I think, open and honest communication, and as we talked about before, flexibility, on the employer side and on the employee side can benefit. Maybe there's, ways to work from home. Maybe there's an adjustable schedule, and I mean, it's really difficult for caregivers, especially of older adults, to say, you know what, I really need this time. If somebody has a child, it's kind of, understood. I've got to pick up my kid up from school. Right. But, when you have an older adult that you're caring for, sometimes it's a little harder to explain.
To convey that experience.
But from an employee and from an employer standpoint, you can't fix what you don't know. If you don't start the conversation, if you don't make your employer aware, you're not giving them the opportunity to make adjustments and be flexible.
So what kinds are you seeing employers when you are consulting with businesses, maybe looking at their HR benefits, are you seeing businesses start to trend in thinking about the caregiving roles that their workers are fulfilling?
Absolutely. Today's workforce, quite frankly, is a lot more demanding, but not in a bad way. We have access to anything we want or need at our fingertips, and you don't go into a meeting without somebody checking their personal device 4 and 5 times.
Right.
So that on-demand mentality is now being applied to the benefits that are offered and what they can do for me as an individual, and how can they help me live a better life and accomplish more while I'm still in my role as an employee, as a mom, as a caregiver, as a daughter, whatever the case may be. So absolutely, smart employers are looking at new and different ways to meet those needs within the workplace.
That's right, yeah, so we're constantly connected to our job, maybe by our phone. We're at home, we're receiving those emails, there's an expectation that we're going to respond to those perhaps. And in the same sense, if you're a caregiver, you have to respond. You've got to do something. So, what are some of those benefits, that folks are considering providing for their employees?
They come in different forms and fashions, obviously depending on the industry, depending on the culture. But job sharing, that's a term that was hot in the 80s, if you will, but it's now become more commonplace in today's world, where one full-time equivalent position will be split among 2 people so that each individual can not only be fulfilled from a work standpoint, but they also can take care of obligations at home. Our firm, for example, we say that we work bus stop hours because we have children, and that's a priority in our lives. So I think it's just whatever fits for the company and for the culture, but truly it goes back to flexibility and having an open mind and the mindset of we can do things differently and still accomplish the same goal.
Yeah.
And I think again, that whole flexibility, because if you're caring for an elderly loved one, they've still got to have to go to their doctor's appointments, and if they're not able to drive, then that loved one is going to have to take that time off of work to be able to get them back and forth to doctor's appointments, or get them back and forth to even grocery shop, or make sure they've got their medication. So that employee that is that caregiver is, is probably going to be constantly thinking about that loved one at home, and that's going to be that stress that's put upon them. And as far as employers, if they would, be able to be more flexible with them, then it's going to make that employee actually a better employee for them, so that they know that my employer's got my back.
So, and Jennifer, what about, where are you in thinking about, like, I need to be letting employers know that this issue is out there? I mean, it seems like right now, we've got a lot of caregivers who are just kind of suffering in silence. They're taking on this burden, and a lot of the responsibility is on their shoulders. But maybe it shouldn't be, right? Should the workplace have a role, perhaps, in reducing some of that stress so that hopefully that worker can then be sustainable?
Yeah, and the Tennessee Respite Coalition actually in our 3-year strategic plan has in it developing some employer education pieces that we can take to employers, tell them, about caregiving, open that discussion so that, possibly talking to them about, do you know who's a caregiver in your workforce? Because a lot of times, just starting that discussion can go miles. So hopefully, really soon we're going to be rolling out some employer training and that. And I think it's so important for employers to understand that, because you need that. Everybody needs that work-life balance. Yeah. Right. As far as feeling fulfilled at work, feeling fulfilled in a caregiver role, and then also the caregiver taking care of themselves, having some extra time for themselves as an individual person too.
Yeah. Last advice for if someone's out there as a caregiver, maybe they're new to this role, that they should do to make their life a little better, a little easier?
Reach out for help.
Yep.
Yeah.
Ask for help.
Don't be afraid. Reach out there. There's potential resources that can help individuals in the home.
Well, we could have spent 30 minutes on each of these different topics this evening, but thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for tuning in to this conversation. For more information and to see all of Nashville Public Television's Aging Matters series, visit our website at wnpt.org/Aging Matters. Thanks for watching.
Major funding for NPT Reports Aging Matters is provided by the West End Home Foundation, improving the quality of life of seniors through the support of nonprofit organizations in Middle Tennessee, the HCA Foundation on behalf of TriStar Health, the Jeanette Travis Foundation, dedicated to improving the health and well-being of the Middle Tennessee community, Cigna Health Spring. Additional support provided by Lyle Parham Wealth Management of UBS Financial Services, Inc., Jackson National Life Insurance Company, the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee, AARP Tennessee, and by members of NPT. Thank you.